What's going on, everybody? I'm Johnny Brook. Welcome back to another Crafted Workshop video. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to build this modern bar stool out of solid walnuts. I built this with a buddy of mine, Grant Batson. He lives over in Nashville. He is a full-time artisan pipe maker and is also building a house for himself and his family. If you guys want to go follow along with what he's doing, check him out on Instagram at TN Tennessee Barnhouse. I'll have links in the video description below. Had a great time working with him. Really happy with the way these came out. I built a pair for myself and Grant built a pair for himself. Pretty simple build overall, definitely some more complicated joinery, kind of a great way to step up your woodworking game if you want, and really happy with the way these came out. They're very comfortable, they fit perfectly in my kitchen, so let's go ahead and get started. So the first step in any project being built out of rough lumber is finding the parts in the wood. I used rough walnut on this project, one of my favorite hardwoods, and the walnut I was using was pretty rough, so I had to work around a lot of knots and other defects to find my parts. Once my parts were laid out, I cut the parts to rough length at the miter saw, and I always leave at least an extra ½ inch of length at this point to be trimmed off later, and I leave even more if the ends of the particular piece will be mitered or cut at an angle. So next I started ripping the pieces to rough width over at the bandsaw. And you could go ahead and flatten your boards before doing this, but that puts a lot of strain on your jointer and planer, and I find that you get a better surface finish when you break the parts down into smaller pieces first. So after breaking the parts down, I started squaring up 2 faces on each piece on the jointer, and this took a while, but it's probably one of the most important parts of the build. Making sure my parts were square here saved me a lot of headaches later on. So with 2 faces square, I squared up one opposing face on the planer, bringing all the parts down to the same thickness at the same time. And as you can see, Grant hasn't piped in his planer with dust collection yet, so we got pretty covered in walnut shavings. Definitely had some man glitter going on that day. So after getting the pieces down to their final thickness, I ripped the pieces to their final width at the table saw. So with all my pieces square on all 4 sides, I could start cutting them to their final length at the miter saw. And if you're interested in building this exact stool, I do have plans available with a detailed cut list, SketchUp file, and step-by-step PDF file, and I'll have a link to the plans in the video description below. Once all the pieces were cut to length, I cut tapers on the front and back legs using the micro jig tapering jig. And this was my first time using this jig, and it was actually a pretty awesome tool, especially if you already have some grippers on hand. And Microjig isn't a sponsor of this build, I just really like the tool, and I'll have a link to it in the video description below. With all the pieces cut to size and all the tapers added, I started cutting the joinery for the piece. So I used my Festool Domino XL for this, but I designed the piece so that it could easily be built with a $20 doweling jig using the exact same techniques. So the first pieces that needed to be joined were the 2 halves of the back leg. And so when designing this, instead of trying to get the back leg out of one piece of wood, I decided that it might be more efficient to join 2 pieces of wood at an angle to form the angle for the backrest. And so once the domino mortises were cut in both of these pieces, I glued the legs together. After letting the glue set up overnight, I sanded the edges of the legs to remove any burn marks, and then passed the pieces through Grant's wide belt sander to clean up the faces of the pieces. Next, I started cutting the joinery on the legs. Again, I used my domino for this, and for this whole project I used 8mm dominoes. There were a bunch of angles in this piece, so cutting the joinery took almost half a day, but Grant and I both managed to get all of the joinery on our stools cut without any errors. It really pays to just take your time and try to be as precise as you can here. So the stool goes together with a basic apron support going around all sides of the seat, and this adds a ton of strength to the seat itself, and there's also a footrest near the bottom of the stool that also helps to stabilize the legs. And again, all the angles and measurements are laid out in the plans if you're interested in replicating these. So once I started getting most of the joinery cut, I realized that the angle for the backrest wasn't quite right and didn't lean back enough. So to fix this, I cut tapers on the top half of the back legs using the bandsaw, and then cleaned up the cuts using the edge sander. So with all the joinery cut on the legs, I started gluing up the sides of the stools. And by dividing a big glue up like this into sub-assemblies, I was able to not only save myself some stress, but I could also focus on each joint, making sure any gaps were removed and to remove any excess glue squeeze out. So while the sides of the stools dried, I started making the seats, and since 3 faces were already squared up, all I needed to do was cut the seat pieces to rough length at the miter saw, rip the pieces to width at the table saw, and then glue them together to form the seat. And the last sub-assembly that needed to be assembled before the whole stool was put together was the footrest and center stretcher. So I waited to cut this center stretcher to length until I could mark it to actual length based on how the stool actually came together in real life, and this ended up working out really well. So again, I used the domino for joinery, but this was actually the first time I'd ever used the domino on the face of a board without referencing any of the edges. So I just used a square to keep the domino aligned, and Grant and I held the domino in place while I cut the mortises. And having 2 sets of hands here was really helpful. So once the joinery was cut on all the pieces, I glued up the footrest and center stretcher and let it dry. So while that was drying, I gave the other pieces a sanding up to 180 grit, making sure any burn marks, pencil lines, or other marks were removed. And next it was time for the final glue up, which really wasn't that difficult due to assembling the parts in stages. So while I'm gluing up the stool, let's talk about one of the sponsors of this week's video, the John C. Campbell Folk School. So I recently had the opportunity to attend a week-long woodworking class at the school, and it was an awesome experience. John C. Campbell is located in Brasstown, North Carolina, about 2 hours from Atlanta, Knoxville, and Asheville, so it's really centrally located to a lot of places in the southeast, and they have classes on everything from woodworking to blacksmithing to drawing and much, much more. So to learn more, visit their website at folkschool.org or check out the link in the video description below. So the last pieces to add after the base was assembled was the backrest and the seat itself. First, I marked the backrest to length and then cut it to length at the miter saw. And with the backrest cut, I cut domino mortises in both the stool and the backrest itself, making sure to set the depth so the domino didn't cut through either piece. Next, I cut my seats to final width using a crosscut sled on the table saw. And once it was at final size, I could cut the joinery for the seat. So having the seat mortised onto the base like this adds a ton of rigidity, and I cut a few of the mortises on the loose settings so that there's room for wood movement. Another great way to add the seat on would have been pocket screws. Finally, I glued on the backrest and the seat, and the stool was fully assembled. And that's as far as we got at Grant's shop. So once I got home from Grant's, I prepped for finish, sanding the stools up to 180 grit and chamfering all the edges during the process. You really want to do some sort of edge treatment on a stool like this because any sharp edges are going to make the stool uncomfortable to sit in for long periods of time. And at last, it was time to apply finish. So for finish, I used Waterlocks, which probably doesn't come as a surprise to most of you since it's one of my favorite finishes for Walnut, and Waterlocks is also one of the sponsors of this week's video. So Waterlocks is a blend of tung oil and resins and creates a really tough, water-resistant finish that is also absolutely beautiful. The tung oil penetrates into the wood while the resins remain elastic, and this combination holds up to wear extremely well. So to learn more about Waterlocks, check out the link in the video description below. And with the finish applied, the stool was done. All right, hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. This was a ton of fun and I'm really happy with the way these came out. I do still have a couple more coats of finish to put on, but I wanted to go ahead and get the video out. I know I'm already a day late, so apologize for that, but just really loving these. They fit my space perfectly and glad to have a pair of these knocked out. Again, I do have plans available for these if you want to build these yourself. I'll have a link to that in the video description below, along with a list of all the materials and tools I used on this project. And before I go, I want to say a big shout out to all my Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome. And last, if you guys don't already, go ahead and get subscribed to the channel. I put out new project videos like this every Tuesday. All right, thanks again for watching, guys, and until next time, happy building.